On rights. That's rights, not rituals, and it refers to something that is of great interest to many people. That is, what are our rights, our natural, assumed privileges which can't be taken away from us? There are several things I've learnt about rights in my life. The first is how very recent the concept that everyone has rights. Of course, in most civilizations, there are graded rights. You have rights as a man, rights as a woman, rights as an old person, rights as a young person, rights for different castes and classes. But the idea that they are universal to all human beings, whatever their age and sex and so on, is very recent. Indeed, in practice, even in the West, in America, black people only got equal rights, if they have them at all, in the last couple of generations. And even the discussion that we hold these rights to be inalienable, which comes from the Declaration of Independence, that idea is in the later 18th century and proclaimed against the tide. They had to proclaim that because no one in most societies had ever even conceived of the idea that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were natural human rights. So it's a very peculiar development in a particular part of the world. From, most people think, starting with the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and then spreading further out. In fact, elements of it, of course, go back much, much deeper. For example, in English law, all English citizens had certain rights in law. For instance, habeas corpus, which is 12th, 13th century, that you had the right to your body, I have a body, and that you could appeal to the law for due process of law, that you should be tried by a court, you should know what the offence was, that there should be a jury. These were not just rights for one class or another, or one gender or another. They were for everyone, and even children had property rights from early on. So it's an old idea, and you find elements of it in Greek philosophy, you find elements of it in monotheistic religions, but it's enshrined as at the national level as a driving force for modern republicanism in France and America. And that's all fine. It's very different. Indeed, in other parts of the world, there's no such idea of universal human rights traditionally in India, in China, Japan, and so on. So it's a minority concern, but many people think it's worthwhile. The difficulty comes with human rights when one part of the world has them and is pretty certain what they are, and other parts of the world don't have those rights. They may have other rights. And so in China, for example, if you asked the Chinese government now what they thought the human rights were, they would say, well, to a decent standard of living, not starving, a decent healthcare system, a decent educational system, safety on the streets, and absence of fear. So they consider these basic and very important human rights, and they make huge efforts lifting 700-800 million people out of poverty in the last 40 years is considered a huge contribution to human rights. The idea that you can go through the day not feeling hungry or starving seems to them as equally important as many of the rights which we proclaim. Ours seem very nebulous, concerned with those very basic ones. The Chinese and other societies also concentrate or stress that all rights have responsibilities, and that for every right you have a responsibility to other people. So it's a mutual relationship rather than a thing within you a very individualistic characteristic, which is a feature of Western thought. Our rights are very individualistic. They are the rights of each person against everyone else and against the state. But this clash of ideas about rights is leading to a lot of tension now. And as I listen to the pronouncements of Western governments about what should happen in other parts of the world, in India, China, Indonesia, whatever, I see that rights have, in a way, superseded the certainties and dogmatism of the missionaries. The missionaries believed that Christian missionaries believed it was the right of everyone to have a chance to worship Jesus and believe in him, and that was absolutely basic for everyone. And they tried to spread that gospel against the local cultural traditions and religions. Now it's the same, and has been for the last 3 or 4 generations, or less than that, since the Second World War, really, when America became the absolutely dominant power in the world. It believed that its rights were universal, and that it had the duty and responsibility and the power to force those rights on other people. So if it encountered some country that didn't abide by its rights, then they would go and try and force it, either directly by military intervention to force democracy as a right, or by embargoes, trade embargoes, and so on. So at the point of a gun, or at the point of a trade embargo, other civilizations and societies should take up our rights. Now, from within our system, we think, well, these are great, and of course everyone should be like us. But looked at from outside, as I do increasingly as I go to Asia and other parts of the world, I can see how one-sided and in many ways blind this whole assumption is. And of course, it's also got other defects. First, one of them is how far do these rights extend? As I say, only recently did they extend to women and black people and so on. But do they extend to animals? Do animals have rights? And recently there's even been a discussion about whether things like forests and mountains and seas, which we now know have some sort of memory and talk among themselves and the rest of it, should they have rights under the Charter of Human Rights? Another feature is, of course, that you support the spread of these rights, but when they run counter to your own policies within your nation state, you just withdraw from them. We have a case going on now in Britain where the Court of Human Rights in Europe has made a pronouncement, and the British government are thinking of withdrawing from that and saying they have no ultimate jurisdiction. We should leave it to British judges, not to an international body of human rights. So who should adjudicate the rights is up for grabs, and who has the rights is up for grabs, and whether we can just have one set of rights that spreads over the whole world and is uniform and originates from one cultural tradition, the Anglosphere, the British, because it's a very Anglo kind of concept, human rights. So we have to think about human rights and not just come out in an automatic fashion saying, oh, that's against my rights or their rights or whatever. It may well be, and it may be arguable, that human beings should be protected in that way. But it's something that is much more nuanced, as I've gradually realized. I'm a greatly fortunate person in having had my rights protected, and I don't want to knock away that. But I can see that from elsewhere it looks a pretty hypocritical and particularistic attitude to say that everyone should be like me, and that it's being used as a weapon now, weaponized, to try and undermine other cultures who you actually are threatened by in other ways. So you don't like their economic growth, and so you concentrate on the human rights of some subgroup within them. Thank you.